Apple, listen, we told you guys to allow alt stores and sideloading on iOS. Why didn't you add it to the iPad?
Sorry, European Union, but the iPad actually doesn't run iOS, it runs iPadOS, so we didn't actually have to.
Oh, shut up, Apple. We know it's the same thing behind the scenes. You just have to allow sideloading and alt stores so that anybody can install any calculator app they want. They don't have to use just yours.
We actually don't have a calculator app anyway.
Really? Well, okay, just, don't add one.
No, of course not. We welcome the competition.
Craig, cancel the calculator app. They don't want it. We just need you to make sure that the iPads are capable of running apps from outside the App Store, just like your Macs do, which are running the same chips as your iPads anyway.
Oh, that's true. Why don't we just find a way to put one of our operating systems on the iPad that allows sideloading in alt stores?
That sounds like a lot of work. Why don't you just get the iPadOS team to update the iPadOS code so we can... Why are you laughing?
You said that there's some iPadOS team somewhere. Oh my god.
Why? Why is that funny? I don't get it, but just... You have 6 months! So the reason I'm using this terminology in today's video of the EU fixing the iPad, and the reason I didn't use that terminology before, is I think iOS for our iPhones is honestly pretty great. There's little nitpicky things here and there, and every once in a while we have a really buggy update, but what OS doesn't these days? So for the most part, I think iOS is great, and I'm a little bit concerned about the European Union's involvement with opening up the App Store and changing all these things, because I feel like let's not break something that's working obviously really well. You know, market share is growing and all that, but when it comes to iPads, with new ones coming next week, most people are in agreement, from what I can see, that we're not that interested in new hardware. Like, okay, it's great that the iPad Air is getting bigger, it's cool that the M4 chip is gonna be a little faster, or the dynamic range with OLED is gonna be a little bit better, but at the end of the day, the reason people don't want to buy new iPads is because iPadOS is fundamentally limited, and people want it to do more. But this new European Union law expansion, which is applying the same laws that Apple's having to implement in experience with the iPhone, is also stretching over to the iPad, and the EU has given Apple a warning of 6 months to implement all of these rules to make it compliant with, you know, third-party app stores and sideloading. It's mostly just about breaking down the walled garden, making sure you can install whatever you want to install, and because Apple only has 6 months, and I think most people's issues with iPads come down to the software capabilities, this one might be a tad more interesting, or I think at least Apple could be a bit more creative with how it's implemented, because it is on an iPad. It's not exactly the same form factor as the iPhone. I mean, that's why Apple doesn't even believe in putting the same OS on both of these things. So if Apple really wanted to find a loophole or find some kind of malicious compliance, as they already have with the iPhone being very strict about how sideloading works and making sure that it's not financially viable for developers anyway, I'm merely suggesting that Apple could simply allow a dual boot option if you connect a keyboard and mouse to the iPad for it to boot into macOS mode. And don't tell me that the iPads can't do it. We've seen macOS run on far inferior Intel hardware, and obviously it could be a slightly skimmed down version of macOS that's maybe not fully unlocked, but it would technically be a roundabout way for them to say that, hey, look, now the iPad allows apps from alternative app stores. It's just the malicious compliance is, oh yeah, but for it to work, you have to buy a keyboard and a mouse and make sure that they're paired to the iPad, then go into settings, download macOS or do some crazy thing. It would obviously work much, much better on the iPad Pros. Apple could pull the whole, and we're gonna work on bringing that to the rest of the iPad lineup later. But given we're supposed to have a big iPad event next week, that might be a great time to kind of update the silicon, maybe upgrade the unified memory on board for more dual boot support. But even if we don't get macOS on the iPad, still, it might incentivize a lot more people to check out the iPad if we're suddenly able to run more emulators on iPadOS and bring more apps outside from Apple's App Store that can now take advantage of the amazing hardware the iPad offers. Unlike just the iPhone, which is like, okay, cool, touchscreen, USB-C port, yada yada. Now the iPad can access, you know, third-party apps that are outside the App Store. It could maybe take full advantage of the Thunderbolt port, the keyboard and mouse connected, and the touchscreen, and the Apple Pencil, plus the LiDAR and the rear cameras and the incredible M2 or M3 or M4, whatever chips they end up shipping in the iPads next week, there's a lot of performance and potential use cases that could be unlocked from the side loading that Apple enables, which I again think the path of least resistance would simply just be bring macOS as a dual boot option to the iPad. You already run macOS. We already know macOS is capable of running on Apple Silicon. Even the A12Z chip from the 2020 iPad Pro is capable of booting into macOS. May not be the most clean experience, but hey, if anything's buggy or laggy when you try to boot macOS onto the iPad, Apple can just say, well, sorry, the EU made us do this. It's not the optimum way to use the iPad. That way, you avoid a lot of the everyday consumers and grandmas from actually downloading the alt stores and side loading, which is Apple's big concern. They don't want the malware, they don't want the scams, and they don't want a really easy way for people to sideload stuff. So if you just turn the macOS dual boot option on, only the nerds are going to know how to do it. So you comply with the law, you get to preserve your App Store fees, because for the most part, everybody's just going to continue to use the iPad as an iPad. The iPadOS team doesn't have to do any work, and Apple doesn't get, kicked out of the EU or have to pay 10% of all profits to the government or some crazy fee like that. So we've been asking Apple to kind of step it up with the iPadOS development lately, and ironically, it sounds like the European Union might be the one that kind of forces Apple to make the iPad somewhat interesting and go into new, exciting directions that might allow it to unlock more apps, more functionality than it currently has. Can someone come up with a macOS emulator, please? And then we'll just boot that onto the iPad. I'm kind of curious to see where this is going. Are you guys more hopeful now for the iPad? The EU already got us Type-C, which we were really excited for. Maybe if the European Union gives us macOS on the iPad, I might just have to move to Europe simply so that I can pay taxes there and thank them for making all of my dreams come true. What are your guys' thoughts? Feel free to drop them down in the comments down below, and thank you to everybody supporting this channel directly. Seriously, helps us out a ton, as does just watching these videos. So thanks again. This is your Apple Sheep here, and I will see you all in the next one.